This is the first of 3 webinar series, and the webinars will take place today, next Wednesday, and the following Friday. And it is about expanding access and understanding to the basic income grant in South Africa. So just to look at the context of why we are here and why we believe that a basic income is necessary and why our research is looking towards that. We know that South Africa is a country characterized by gross poverty, inequality, and destitution. Unemployment is at an all-time high with a rate of 44.4%. With the COVID-19 pandemic wreaking havoc in all spheres of South African life over the last 2 years, our society's fault lines have been exposed for all to clearly see. Working age people lack access to social assistance, and there are no policies yet that have been put forward to address people's needs and stimulate economic growth and inclusive pathways into work, despite many headline commitments. Instead, National Treasury regularly repeats its commitment to austerity budget principles. Little cognizance seems to exist for the greater destitution occasioned by the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, beyond the reluctant reintroduction of the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress Grant, and that only until March 2022. It is in this context that SPI, the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, has intensified the long-standing call for the implementation of the upper bound poverty line indexed Universal Basic Income Guarantee, or BIG, in South Africa. The BIG is both a humanitarian social assistance measure and an economic stimulus with the potential to transform the socioeconomic landscape of our country by ensuring the economic inclusion of the majority of South Africans, whilst providing the basic security. In 2021, with the support of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FES, SPIES commissioned 3 critical input papers on the BIG with the purpose of informing and advancing evidence-based research and social dialogue on the implementation of a BIG in South Africa. These papers form the basis of the FES SPI BIG webinar series and will deliver evidence-based insights on the following 3 themes. Firstly, an annotated summary of lessons from the main BIG pilots undertaken since 2000 globally. That will be next week's topic. Sorry, I hadn't updated on the restructuring of our series. So the first one, which is today, is a basic income guarantee for a better South Africa, the evolution of social assistance after 1994. And that is a paper that was written by Duma Krobule. And today's respondents to that will be Peter Leroux and Dr. Siraj Mohammed. The second paper is the Global Basic Income Grant Pilot since 2000, annotated summaries of lessons for South Africa. And the main author on that paper was Nkululeko Majozi, who's a social security researcher at SPI. And the respondent on that paper will be Guy Standing, would be the first respondent, and Dr. Guillermo Delgado, who is at the University of Namibia and who co-authored an earlier paper that SPI commissioned last year and this year on basic income in the SADC region. And the third paper will be a deeper analysis of the multiplier potential effects of a basic income guarantee for the South African economy, which was also authored by Duma Krobule. And that webinar will take place on Friday, the 22nd of October. SPI and Duma Krobule have also been working with Telkom as a great enabler of social dialogue around a basic income grant, and will be partnering with the esteemed Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation for a series of dialogues and roundtables that will begin at the end of this month as we reach out to leaders in the private sector and into spaces not usually our terrain. SPI is also an active member of the Financial Sector Campaigns Coalition and NEDLAC Community Constituency, where we have raised and kept alive the demand for a universal basic income in all possible spaces through NEDLAC. We welcome the partnering with the NEDLAC Community Constituency to this series. And we also just want to recognize the ongoing support of our long-standing partner, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. This year, our collaboration with the Institute included not only these 3 research papers, as well as the webinar series, but also our annual Decent Standard of Living Colloquium, which was hosted last month. And we do thank FES for making for making that possible. So this is a very busy time and a critical period. I'd like to thank you to the SPI team, Kobile, Nkululeko, Lindy K, Tina, Mpo, Michaela, and Angelo for the support that we have and the team that we have working on this. SPI will be launching a basic income grant for a better South Africa website in coming days. That'll be a location for as much research as can hold. And also a platform for the growing number of testimonies that people are sending in to answer the question, what would a basic income guarantee do to your life? So those testimonies share people's dreams of how their lives will be enriched through a universal decent income guarantee. And we'll have the link in the chat and the date on which that will be live. So thank you for being here to all of you. Many of you are partners who've been on this journey with us for many years, and it is we humbly acknowledge that. I'm just going to quickly take us through the webinar series program. So following me will be Uta Dirksen, who's the resident director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in South Africa. And I will then introduce the main speaker, who is Duma Krabule, who will then speak for 30 minutes on his paper, which will be available as soon as it will be available to everybody. Lindy Kay will then speak from SPI, will introduce Professor Peter Leroux, who is the first respondent. His response will be 15 minutes, and then Nkululeko from SPI will introduce Dr. Siraj Mohammed as the second respondent, and then we will open for questions and answers. The panel will get an opportunity for a roundup last comments, and then Kobile Zulu, our research manager, will give the thanks and closing comments. So thank you, Uta, and I invite you to give your joint welcome speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you so much to the team of SPI for making this seminar, this webinar possible. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you in the name of FES as well. I mean, you all know that the South African Constitution guarantees the universal right to social security, but you all also know that clearly this right is not realized in the reality of life of the majority of the population. In a context where half of the population live in poverty, while 50% of the national wealth is held by the richest 1% of the population, clearly poverty and inequality prevail. So it's no wonder that the concept of a basic income grant has long played a role in South African policy discourse. And I believe South Africa was probably one of the first countries where this was seriously discussed, and where policymakers seriously engaged with the idea of a basic income grant, which in recent years, of course, has taken quite momentum in international debates and in other countries as well. And of course, as we all know, COVID has acted as a catalyst to the social crisis in many countries around the world, and sadly also here in South Africa. So it's little surprise that the debate around a basic income grant has had a resurgence, really. Now, for me, as a recently fairly new arrival to South Africa, I've been following these debates with great interest, public debate, the media articles, the opinion pieces. And really, for me, in that debate, there were a couple of themes that really stood out or that really struck me. One is the covert, but sometimes also overt anti-poor discourse that shines through. The deep mistrust of the poor and how they spend their money, while we have ample empirical evidence from around the world that people spend their money sensibly and very productively to improve their lives. Secondly, that false dichotomy between employment and a basic income grant. A basic income grant might provide economic stimulus, but also, I mean, again, the empirical evidence from around the world shows that a basic income does not discourage people from seeking employment. Quite the contrary, it might actually enable them to engage with the labor market because they're not fighting to get food on the table every day, but they're actually freed up in their time and in their capacity to search employment. And thirdly, just how deeply ingrained that logic of austerity is in the public discourse. The large majority of debates comes back to the question of affordability, but affordability defined on a quite narrow and neoliberal conception of macroeconomic and fiscal policy. I believe that the paper that we are launching today does a formidable job of addressing these false dichotomies in reviewing a number of recent research papers that establish a methodologically solid and evidence-based basis to debate viable options for basic income grant. And I hope that you will enjoy the presentation as much as I enjoyed reading the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ute, and thank you to the Foundation for your support, and for other actors in the landscape who are looking into basic income, including the Institute for Economic Justice. And we welcome them to participation in this webinar and look forward to debate going forward. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Duma Krobule. I'm just smiling because I think we really have between FES and SPI sort of dragged the last lifeblood out of Duma, particularly today, because he was just presenting in the previous webinar, that panel that we were doing. So Duma has spent more than 2 decades as a financial journalist, analyst, researcher, and advisor on issues of economic development and transformation. He was educated at Waterford Kamklaba's School in Swaziland, and after that Aberdeen University in Scotland, where he obtained a master's degree in economics. Duma first worked as a financial journalist for most of the country's leading publications. His work was recognized, and he later worked for the Black Economic Empowerment Commission, chaired by President Cyril Ramaphosa. He was co-author of the Commission's landmark report, which paved the way for the country's current Black economic empowerment laws and policies. He was editor of the book Making Mistakes, Righting Wrongs, Insights into Black Economic Empowerment, which reviewed the country's economic development and transformation policies during the first decade of democracy. He is a Business Day columnist and a prominent public speaker and commentator on issues related to the economic development and transformation of South Africa. And we welcome him to share the presentation on basic income. And I hand over to you, Duma.
Thank you, Isabel. Now, I need to find my presentation, if you don't mind. Oh, God. I should have done a test drive. Sorry.
That is fine. Is there anyone who needs to be helping Duma from our magnificent SPI support?
Yeah, can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
And can you see me? I can't
Yes.
see myself. Yeah.
Yeah, we can. It's very disconcerting, but we have eyes on you as well.
No, I can't see myself. I've got to ask myself, how do I see myself on this? Yeah.
Page down in the small frames, we see your small frame. The big frame is the presentation.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay, I'm a bit vain, but anyway, thanks a lot for. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Isabel and SPI for commissioning me to do this paper, and also to the support of the FES. I do remember an amazing trip I went to Germany with. I can't remember which foundation paid for it, but I got to know a lot about the German economy. So I just wanted to say also that unlike Isabel, I haven't been on this journey for a very long time. And until recently, I was agnostic about whether we have a job guarantee or basic income. And in 2019, where can I start? 2019, I was doing writing column for Business Day, looking at the ANC's NEC Lekgotla recommendations. And what they talked about is that they wanted to halve unemployment by 2024. So I looked at the numbers. What would that mean practically for us to halve unemployment? And the numbers were quite frightening. I think we had to create 1.5 million jobs a year. Then I said, well, if the government does everything that I say they must do, and we're not going to create that many jobs to halve the unemployment rate, we have to look at basic income. The second quite important thing that happened to me was just after the start of the pandemic. I was in a webinar, speaking at a webinar at the presidency, where people were talking about all their proposals on how to respond to the crisis, the unprecedented crisis that we had. And I noticed that everybody was trying to make their proposals smaller, and everybody started the presentation with something by saying, well, we have a fiscal crisis and we should try and make this presentation smaller. And I thought that was bizarre, because I was reading everywhere in the papers throughout the world that the mantra was, we shall do whatever it can. And I was reading all the stimulus packages from South Korea to Malaysia to the UK and all over the world. People were trying to do whatever they could to address the crisis. And then there was a proliferation of all these papers about that, which I review in the report and in the research paper, that were talking about how to finance the basic income grant. And I noticed again that a lot of them were talking about how to make this thing smaller. They are like proposals of how to make it by age, by employment status, and also to different ways of making it smaller and how to finance it. And most of them talked about how to have taxes to pay for the whole basic income. So I just thought it made no sense to have a fiscally neutral basic income grant, because for two reasons. It defeats the purpose of having a stimulus to the economy. As you know, our economy is in a desperate situation. We have unemployment and we've got, it's a desperate situation that we have. We have a desperate situation in our economy. And so it made no sense to me. And the second issue is that, sorry, someone's playing with my presentation. I'm not sure what's going on. Yeah. Okay, sorry. There it is, yeah. Okay. So what on earth is going on? Sorry, everyone. So those are the issues. So that's by way of background. I just have to apologize that this presentation is very long. It's the first time that I've done it. So in future presentations, I'll obviously cut it down. And yesterday I had 9 hours of no power. And this morning I had a WITS webinar as well. So I haven't had time to cut it down. So what I'll do is I'll go through it very quickly, but we'll distribute later for people who want to see the presentation. Yeah. So now I just want to, sorry about this, man.
Sorry to interject, Duma.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my screen. Yeah.
But I don't think you're sharing the screen. So I thought to share the screen for you. So if you will guide me which slide I must scroll to.
So hang on, I thought you could see the screen when I showed it, yeah.
No, we're only seeing you. So I figured it was me that was sharing the screen before.
Oh, okay. Can I just try and share it for myself, because I prefer to.
Okay, let me stop sharing, then you can share from your side.
Okay. I think Kuleko left to share it. Hang on. No, I think Kuleko left to share. I don't know what's going on.
All right. Let me find it again.
We should have done a dry run on this before. Yeah. So thank you very much. So the introduction, thanks Kuleko. So basically, this whole story about basic income starts with I can't see myself again, sorry. But it starts with the Constitution, which says that everyone has the right to social security, including, if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, appropriate social assistance. The state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to achieve. I don't know what's going on. There's a lot of background noise and everything. I keep hearing echo.
There's feedback. Is there any way of controlling the feedback?
Oh, sorry, I have a speaker here. Let me unmute quickly.
Okay, so, and then Martin Luther King, he says, I'm now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a new widely discussed measure called the guaranteed income. We need, and then later on, just after he dies, in an article in Look magazine, he says we need an economic bill of rights. This would guarantee a job to all people who want to work and are able to work. It will also guarantee an income for all who are not able to work. Some people are too young, some are too old, some are physically disabled, and yet in order to live, they need an income. Thanks, Nkuleko. And the paper just starts with a brief overview of the evolution of social security assistance before 1994. Nkuleko, there's a slide before this one. Yeah, so we just look at social assistance before 1994. Because of time, I won't really go into this, so you can move to the next slide. And also this one. But anyway, and we'll move on to the next slide in Nkuleko, just for speed reasons. And so what I'll look at just quickly by the way of context is to look at the macroeconomic policies and performance of the economy after 1994. So obviously between 1994 and 2020, we've had a GDP per capita was 16% higher in 2020 than it was in 1994. It was the same level as it was in 2005. So the crisis decimated about 15 years of meager growth in GDP per capita. So the first period we had from the RDP to GEAR, the thing that puzzles me most about South Africa is that the debt to GDP ratio in 1996 was 49.5%. But we were convinced that we had a debt crisis. The foreign debt was 1.9% of GDP. The inflation rate was at 7%, but the government implemented these slash and burn macroeconomic policies. And we had sky high interest rates between May and August 1998, from 15% to 22%. Unemployment soared to 8 million people, 40.6%, from 4.6 million in 1996. We had a post-GEAR boom. It was within the context of the world equities and commodity boom. And strangely, the world equity market started growing up immediately after the Iraq war. And when you look at the graph, there were expansionary. Many people believe that it was due to the commodity boom. I say, no, that's not true. You haven't looked at the data very closely. We had expansionary monetary and fiscal policies. Interest rates dropped by 650 basis points. And between 2003 and 2008, public investment increased by an astonishing 19.2% a year. Investment increased to 23.5% of GDP in 2008 from 16%. Employment increased by 3.1 million people to 14.8 million in December 2008 from 11 point, sorry, it's a mistake here. But what I have to say, and the unemployment rate fell to 28.7% from 40.6%. I must just mention here, I went to great lengths to get this data from Stats SA because I refuse to publish any story or any writing that refers to the official definition. So I asked them to do me a time series which didn't exist according to the expanded definition. And I was on an interview with Al Jazeera, and they said, we haven't seen these numbers. So I said, oh no, by the way, I'm the only person in South Africa who's seen these numbers. But anyway, and people talk about this being driven by commodities, but there are a whole range of indicators in the paper that show that this wasn't a commodities boom. Just the most important one is that we had growth in all sectors of the economy, except mining, which lost 100,000 jobs. So that should show you that this was not a commodity-driven boom. There were reports by the Chamber of Mines, the Mineral Council as it's called, which explained why South Africa did not benefit from the boom of this period. And then we have what I started calling in my writings the lost decade. in terms of economic development between 2009 and 2019. The South African Communist Party calls it the crisis before the crisis. GDP capita did not grow during this period. 153 developing and emerging economies grew by 4.8% a year. Our GDP declined by 1.5% in 2009. We lost 1 million jobs. But there was a slow recovery as GDP rose by 2.8% a year between 2010 and 2013. Then between 2014 and 2009, there was a collapse of trend GDP growth rate. And then there was a public sector investment strike after 2015. There's been a collapse of public sector investment as well. So state-owned companies' investment has dropped between 2015 and 2019, it dropped by 30.7%, public sector investment. State-owned companies dropped by 47.4% between 2013 and 2019. So that is basically the context in which we get into the crisis. The crisis after the crisis. So what we have currently is intersecting public health, humanitarian, and economic crisis. I won't talk about the public health crisis, although I have a lot to say, but the economy created 173,000 jobs between December 2008 and June 2020. The labor force increased by 6.2 million people. Therefore, the number of unemployed people increased by 6 million to 11.9. So we now have unemployment rates of 74.8% for youth, 48.7% for Black Africans, 53.2% for Black African females, 53% in the Eastern Cape, where half my family comes from, 50.3% in the Northern Cape, and 49.9% in Limpopo. South Africa is now an unviable society. The unemployment crisis is a national disgrace, the most heartbreaking betrayal of the promises and dreams of our liberation. I went to prison in apartheid South Africa at the age of 15. I was arrested coming from school in Swaziland. And I went to prison, and by the time I left the country to go to Scotland, at the age as a teenager, I had 2 treason trials, and I'd also been in prison for about 9 months in solitary confinement. And this is not what we signed up for. And don't go too fast. I say, this is not what we signed up for. The time has come to change course and chart a new path for economic development for our country. Thanks, Nkululeko. So I'll also look at social assistance after 1994, a lot of background information. So the budget at the time was 60% for old age pensions, 24% for disability. There was something called the state maintenance grant that had been introduced, I think, in the 1930s. But the big problem with this grant is that only 0.2% of African mothers and children had this access to the state maintenance grant. And this grant was paid to the mother and also paid to the child. I think the mother got more than the child. So there was also racial parity for the old age and disability was implemented, I think, in 1996. The Lund Committee recommended the phasing out of the state maintenance grant and the introduction of a new child support grant for children aged 0 to 9. In 1998, the government introduced the child support grant for children aged 0 to 7, and the Taylor Committee, the seminal landmark committee, recommended that the grant should be extended to all children. It took 15 years from 1998 to extend it to all children. The Taylor Committee also recommended the introduction of basic income grant of 100 Rand a month. So now this is the current situation in terms of our social assistance programs. We have the old age grant, which is 44% of it goes to, sorry, this is a bit mistaken in terms of this graph, but the old age grant goes to 3.9 million people. The child support grant goes to 13.2 million people, and 44% goes to the old age grant, 38% to the child support grant, and about 12% for disability. And we had the social relief of distress grant of 350 rands. And according to the president's speech, 8.3 million people got the first payment, but the budget was for 9.4 million beneficiaries, including caregivers. Thanks, Nkululeko. In 1919-20, we spent 2.7 billion on social protection. That was 3.4% of GDP. This included 175 billion, 2.9% of GDP on social grants for 18 million beneficiaries. In 1996, the government spent 2.4% of GDP on 2.9 million beneficiaries. So there's been a small increase, 0.5 of a percentage point of GDP that must now be shared with 15 million more beneficiaries. Thanks, Nkululeko. So just a bit more on the assessments. So I looked at the ILO's latest World Social Protection Report. In South Africa, we have 49.3% of the population covered by one social protection benefit. Second in Africa after Tunisia, but halfway to the goal of universal coverage. The world average is 46. Other regions are Europe and Asia, 83%, America, 64%. We spend 5.5% of GDP compared with the world average of 12.9%. Everybody says we spend a lot on social security. I don't see it in the data. I've been looking at this data before the ILO report. The expenditure in other regions was Europe and social Asia is 17.4%. In Japan, I think it was an astonishing figure, something like 18 or 19%, that Japan had a really high figure. I can't remember what it was. The Americas, 16.6%, the Pacific, 7.5%, Arab states and Africa, so forth. So, so it is not high by international standards what we spent on social protection. South Africa had very high coverage of 76.6 for child and family benefits. This is above the world average of 26.4. Thanks, Nkululeko. Yeah. And then we spent 1.5% of GDP on children and families, which is above the global average, but the child support granted $460 per month is 36% below the food poverty line of $624 per month. So we had quite wide coverage for older people. This was above the world average of 77.5. But there was poor coverage of only 11.9% for unemployed people. This was below the global average of 18.6%. So the UN Covenant on Social and I can't say this thing, man. I always struggle with it. So the UN committee, I'll just call it the UN committee, said in 2018 report that levels of all social non-contributory social assistance benefits were too low to ensure an adequate standard of living. It said there was no coverage for people aged between 18 and 59, and they did call for a basic income grant as well. So this passage from the Taylor Committee summarizes it. It said, the last vestiges of state racial discrimination have been subsequently removed, but a key underpinning principle of the old system remains in place, i.e. the assumption that those in the labor force can support themselves through work and that unemployment is a temporary condition. In reality, those who cannot find work and who do not or no longer qualify for the UIF payments fall through a vast hole in the social security net. Ideally, people should be able to earn a living through employment rather than rely on welfare payments. However, given the size of the unemployment problem and the extent of the growth challenge, full employment is not a feasible scenario in the short to medium term. Thanks, Nkululeko. So then I'm going to look quickly at the global and South African responses to the crisis. The global stimulus packages were 16 trillion by 17th March, according to the IMF. This was 17% of world GDP, according to the IMF. The direct state contribution was 10 trillion or 10.6% of world GDP. Central banks in the United States, the Eurozone, Japan, and the UK printed about $10 trillion between the end of December 2019 and June 2019 to support their economies. For the first time, 20 emerging market central banks implemented quantitative easing, the purchase of government bonds on the primary and secondary markets. The IMF concluded that this was a success. It had lowered the cost of capital and had not contributed towards currency depreciation. Every time I talk about the need that this is an option that we have, people say, no, we don't have a reserve currency, there'll be depreciation, but there's the evidence of every single country that implemented, developing country, that implemented the QE policies that were done in the advanced economies did not have currency depreciation. There was no punishment from international investors. And I saw a recent article that there have been actually positive spillover effects from the advanced economy, and because the money from the advanced economy goes to developed countries' search of yields. So on 21st April, the president announced a 500 billion stimulus package that was allegedly worth 10% of GDP. And in all my columns and writings in the paper, I debunked this myth, and there was no 10% of GDP stimulus package. In a report I did for SPY and with Isabel, we looked through the smoke and mirrors of this package and we found that National Treasury effectively cancelled the stimulus. The real stimulus, new money that was injected in the economy, was only 123.5 billion. And most of this money happened off budget. It was the UIF and the loan guarantee scheme. UIF 60 billion, the loan guarantee scheme 20 billion rands. So the contribution from the government was minuscule. In October 2020, the government announced the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan, which is 2 pillars. 100 billion infrastructure fund to leverage private investment. Let us remember that this fund was launched as a 400 billion rand fund in September 2018 in response to a recession that happened in the first 2 quarters of that year. But in February 2019, the Treasury cancelled that commitment that the president had made, and they called it a 100 billion rand infrastructure fund. There's been no allocation fund ever since. In the latest budget, there was an allocation of 4 billion rands, but in a presentation to the ANC, Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, said that they've only spent 1.7 billion rands, allocated 1.7 billion, and 2.3 billion underspending had been used to pay for the 19.6 billion wage settlement. So the government is not serious about its own infrastructure fund. The structural reforms, it refers to, it's called for privatization, deregulation, liberalization, and withdrawal of the state from network industries, electricity, transport, telecoms, and water. Investment was 13.7% of GDP in 2020. There is a 952 billion rands annual shortfall to meet the NDP target of 30%. Public investment collapsed 36% between 2013 and 2020, by 55% in state-owned companies between 2013 and 2020. The plan, the recovery plan, does not address how to reverse public sector investment strike, which is the main reason for the collapse of total investment. Eskom, sorry? Sorry?
You have 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'll just speed up then. So, well, the government has changed the licensing threshold for these for Eskom, and that's going to create about 25 billion a year. Transnet 10 billion, so it will only close 3.7% of the annual shortfall. So the structural reforms at Eskom and Transnet are going to have no impact in terms of the investment shortfall. And the business invests when their customers at the door. The government's recovery plan pins its hope on providing to customers only for the private sector. And let's just move on a bit quicker because I'm running out of time. I won't talk about the austerity budget. I won't talk about the SRD grant that was ended ahead of the lockdown and the social unrest that happened after it, and also the stimulus package that followed after that. You can all read it in the report. Let's continue. But the main thing here is that we are heading on this trajectory towards a second lost decade. So now what we did now in the report is to review some of these reports that have come out. There was one by Vivian Taylor called Social Protection Pathways to a Basic Income Grant. The Department of Social Development's papers, I looked at them, basic income support for the unemployed. Colin Coleman's proposal that was caused a lot of debate in the media in terms of from a true speed society to one that works for all. I remember before he made this presentation in Cape Town, he reached out to me and said, I'm going to shake a few trees, Duma. But anyway, then the fourth one was Towards Income Security for All by the Institute of Justice, their policy brief. Universal Basic Income Guarantee, Financing Options, DNA Economics for IEJ. Let's move on. A Fiscally Neutral Basic Income Grant Scenarios by ADRS. Micro-Simulation Analysis by SASPRI. Thanks to Gemma for answering all my questions when I see she's on the here. She's been at this longer than I have. The Deloitte report for NEDLAC, the ANC ETC report, and the IntelliDex report for Business Unity South Africa. So those are some of the reports that we looked at. Some of the selected taxes to pay for big, the wealth tax that everybody knows about, social security tax, I just selected the large ones, resource rent tax. In another life, I used to write a lot about mining. I know all about resource rent taxes and how they work. eliminates retirement fund contribution deductions, medical aid credits. These are just some of the taxes that we used to pay for the big in all these proposals. Yeah. Good echo. And then the criticism of the proposals. They say they're unaffordable. We cannot, as Intelligex says, we cannot have a permanent or forever increase in grants. It will result in a debt crisis. The proposed taxes, this is from Intelligex, are very large as a percentage of personal income tax, corporate income tax, and VAT. It can be counterproductive and reduce GDP growth. I also agree with this, but from another perspective. You do not tax people during a recession and fragile recovery. We must specify which taxes that we want to increase, and I believe that we should have the wealth taxes. Some of these taxes on the rich, we should have them, all of them, yeah. But the taxes on the majority of South Africans, I wouldn't propose having those taxes. As I said, it defeats the purpose of having a stimulus. Fully funded, so the ADRS and NEDLAC and Deloitte fully funded scenarios resulted in a very small stimulus through reallocation effect from rich to poor people. We have more propensity to spend. It's based on what the false notions of public finance that equate national budget with the household budget. I think the agenda is to quash neoliberal objections to deficit financing. It's a static analysis that doesn't take into account fiscal multipliers, the additional GDP generated by each rand of spend. Big can generate tax revenues that would not have happened without it, yeah. They seek to minimize the size to address the self-imposed constraint using criteria such as age and employment status. But poverty is pervasive and cuts across age and employment status. The whole point of the grant is that it must be large enough to provide a meaningful stimulus to the economy. Targeting the unemployed only would leave out millions of people who are the employed poor, the working poor. And these proposals also retain harmful austerity policies and also eventually counter affordability and stability issues. The big can only be implemented within the context of a new macroeconomic framework with a higher GDP growth rate. A forever increase in social security spending is affordable if there is a forever increase in the size of the economy or GDP. With a higher GDP growth rate, many things will become affordable. We as a country can afford to dream again and start to imagine a different type of economy. So Uta talked about the false binaries, which I really won't go into. There's the one of production versus consumption. Let's just move on as well and move on the slide, please. There's the one about income and jobs, and I think Uta dealt with it very convincingly. And it's a false dichotomy between basic income grants and jobs here. Let's move on again. So what I say is that, let's just go back to the previous slide, and this is the key to my proposal. So I say that internationally, the universal basic income and job guarantees are seen as competing proposals. But Martin Luther King said the two policies, he saw them as complementary. Many people I've been reading say we can do both. Pavlina Cherneva says that dichotomy of policies that target only income or only employment is no longer constructive. An effective safety net must provide both a guaranteed income and guaranteed work opportunities. In South Africa, most people would still want a job after receiving basic income. So a dignity floor at the upper bound poverty level and universal social security could eliminate income poverty in 3 years. But this is a very low floor. We must set a higher bar for human well-being. There must be a second dignity floor at the level of the living wage. A job guarantee at the living wage could create a new floor for private sector wages and lift millions of people. Sorry. Sorry. I was wondering why I wasn't familiar with the way this presentation is going. It's because we're on Teams. I don't understand why. Yeah, but anyway, so what I said is that this is a very low floor. We must set a higher bar for at the level of a living wage. So the expanded public works program has a budget of 3 billion rands a year.
You've got an expanded 5 minutes left.
I can't see anything on my screen. Everything's gone black. It's because of this Teams interface. Yeah.
Khululeko, can you assist at this point?
I'm not sure. Can everyone see the presentation though?
Okay, now I
From
can,
the presenter.
okay, now I can see it. Yeah.
All right.
So the paper talks about the need to increase the expanded public works program. Yeah. So let's move on, Khululeko. Yeah. So I talk a little bit about public debt and the big. I really won't go into that. The presentation. We can continue to the next slide as well. And these are the scenarios that there's not much time, Isabel, to go through the actual heart of the presentation. What should I do?
I think if you just use the next 5 minutes to look at the main models.
Okay, so there's 8 scenarios that we look at. There's 4 scenarios that use the IHA assumption of a 60% uptake. And then there's 4 models that look at the IHA assumption of an 80% uptake. And then there's 2 scenarios for each of these scenarios that look at implementation of the big alone with fiscal multipliers of 1.5 and 2 times, and 2 scenarios that look at big and the child support grant proposals. Yeah. So let's just move on. Yeah. So financing, all 8 scenarios assume that there will be implementation of a big and an increase in the child support grant to the upper poverty line over 3 years. This is not for reasons of affordability, because there is no financial constraint. It is to ensure that there's ongoing stimulus to the economy that is not exhausted after 3 years. So it must be, as I said, implemented within the context of a 6% growth target. So I propose 2 stimulus, one based on big and one based on the expanded public works program to create jobs. And let's move on to the next one. So then the second stimulus in terms of the expanded public works program, and all of them assume a debt financed implementation of the grant. So let's just move on to the next one. Yeah. The next slide. And the next slide. So these are the scenarios in terms of what happened, the previous one. Yeah. So what happens is that this is the one where we have big alone, and then the second one is where we have big and we extend it to the children. So the first scenario that I looked at, these are the preferred scenarios, is the big only scenario, and then the one is the big, and then we extend it to children. So the first scenario provides a direct stimulus to the economy of about 216 billion rands. The second one, so I found that that was not enough of a stimulus to the economy, and I thought, let us just extend it in terms of extending it to children as well. So that stimulus was 360 billion rands over 3 years. So let's just move on again. And then this explains the 3 sources of financing of this thing. So there's the gross cost of the, with the multiplier of 1.5. And so the gross cost is let's just look at the food poverty line, 150 billion rand. Then there's the VAT of 12%, the recoup from taxpayers, which is the SASPRI and GEMA's proposal, and then the increase in tax revenue, which we calculated based on National Treasury assumptions, the stimulus effect. So what we found here is that about 2/3 of this, well, 3/4 of the stimulus would pay for itself. The money would come back to government eventually. So although it's not a relevant, because this is funded upfront through debt, but at the end of the day, about three quarters of the money comes back to government, according to the calculations in the paper. And let's move on again. So let's move on again. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And again to the end. Yeah. So this is just basically the final proposal that I want to talk about. And I would have preferred to talk a lot about the debt situation, but I won't. But so the budget 2021 had forecast an increase in public debt to 5.2 trillion, 77% of GDP. The big alone option results in an increase in debt to 77% of GDP. The big and child support grant proposal results in 76.8% of GDP. Therefore, the debt ratio will be virtually the same after implementing either of the scenarios. So if the debt is the same without the grant or with the grant, so is there a reason not to implement the basic income grant? Sorry about the technical glitches. Thank you very much. And then there's other financing options, which I won't really go into. But in practice, the implementation of the grant will not just be debt. There are different ways of financing it, which I really won't go into it. A separate paper I looked at about 11 ways of financing a fiscal stimulus, which I really won't go into. Yeah.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much, Duma, for your lovely proposal. Okay, thank you very much, Duma, for your lovely proposal and laying the groundwork for the 3-series webinar. I think you've definitely opened the debate on where South Africa spends its money and the microeconomic policies in place. I think everyone can agree that you really you opened our eyes and raised some interesting points. Secondly, thank you so much for speaking to the microeconomic policies and introducing the various models. I'm sure we'll have a robust debate in the question and answer session. I have the honor of introducing our first respondent, Prof. Peter Leroux. Peter Leroux has degrees in law and economics and a postgraduate degree in research. He worked at the Institute for Social Development, and he has supervised numerous students, master students and PhD students. He retired in 2011. I'd like to give the floor to Peter Leroux to deliver his address. Peter Leroux, the floor is yours.
Thank you first, Duma, for a very interesting paper. It really is worth going through it. And I think he's raised a lot of important and interesting issues. And thank Lindy for the introduction, although I would have liked to see you while you talk to us. You never had your video on. Duma, you went through the same phase as a lot of people. In fact, myself too, in the 90s, I was all for job creation as the main focus. And then by the late 90s, one started realizing it's no way that this is going to happen. And then when my students did the work for the job summit for the president's office, for COSATU, with the president's office organized a job summit in 97, I think. I first heard about the income grant. I was first skeptical, and when I started looking at their research, I became totally convinced that this is a way that will, as Ute said, create more jobs and at the same time deal effectively with poverty. I think there's a lot of what you said that I'd like to respond to. I first just want to give a little bit of a general picture of what I think is so important in this. South Africa must realize we're not only there for South Africa, but what happens in South Africa can be very important for the whole of Africa. I realized that when I really came to speak to us at UWC at a lunchtime meeting, where we discussed what has gone wrong in Africa. His argument was that a continent needs one country to fly ahead, like a bird that cuts through in front and pull the others along. In the Far East, it was first Japan, and then later Taiwan, Korea, and now it's China. The big bird is flying ahead. In Africa, he said Nigeria had the potential, but it was misplayed because of the corruption. In the Congo, the potential was never realized because of the coup there by a person that just took care of himself. And he foresaw that South Africa, together with the SADC countries, could play that role. So it was very important that we launched our policies that could pull Africa ahead. Now, unfortunately, in South Africa, as you have indicated in your paper, it has not happened yet. And South Africa has been very important in growth and has had success stories for certain sections of the world. After the discovery of gold, the first major beneficiary was the United Kingdom. They got control of our gold mines, which was the purpose of the Anglo-Boer War. They got the benefits of controlling financial capital. And clearly, the very, very rapid growth of our gold mines, a lot of it benefited the United Kingdom. Then after the 1994 whites-only workers' riots on the mines and rebellion, the picture changed. The Labour Party and the National Party took over. And in the next 40 years, we had quite rapid growth from 1926 to 1976, 5%, which for that period of the world is quite high. Japan and Sweden, about the other two countries that had a similar growth in that whole period. But it benefited only a small group of the South African population. It was a whites-only growth. The growth was through higher taxes on the mines, windfall profits, and investment in education and work opportunities on the one hand, but also exclusion through job reservation and so of the majority of South Africans' population from the workforce. This model ran into serious problems after the 1976 when Black South Africans would no longer tolerate the exploitation. And it came to an end in 1996 with the transfer. And then one had hoped that the right policies would be in place to get the growth rates of 6% you're talking of, which is not easy. You look at the countries in the world, it's quite tough to get that, particularly when you don't have any major source of growth. The models can easily let one grow 6%, but how are you going to get it? Now, the South African case, I think the reality is we have to grow through very efficient management of our resources, very efficient running of our public companies like the electricity producing companies, the railways, the South African Airways. And if you look at what has happened there, it has not been efficient. The major reduction in investment you speak of is partly because those institutions are all falling apart at the seams. They're not working efficiently. So although I agree totally with your financial analysis that we can potentially support high growth and an income grant at the same time, it will have to be with a totally different management structure of these organizations. If you look at the history of what happened there, they were efficiently run from 1930 to 1970, less efficiently after that. And in the Zuma years, they were just exploited. The funds flew out of those organizations, as we knew from Eskom and so, for corrupt purposes. And to turn this around is a major challenge. In 2001, when I failed to convince the ANC for the case for a basic income grant, I did convince Zola Skweyiya, and he fought for it for years. But unfortunately, Thabo wouldn't go along with it, and neither would Trevor. And when I failed to do that, I thought I'd take it a bit to the business sector. And Jannie Maton and a whole group of the Stellenbosch economists, a businessman, really got convinced that an income grant would be good and tried to convince Trevor of it, and they didn't succeed. So we have the problem, therefore, that you have to have both the government convinced of it and private sector. Today, I'm afraid I'm trying in the private sector again to get support for this. And they say, well, any money that is raised will not be used for the purposes we pretend it will be. Look at what happened now. So there's a whole worry about the money being misappropriated and misspent. And that will have to be dealt with if we are going to get anything along the lines of growth that you are proposing. If we have a well-run, efficient economy, taxes well spent, I think the types of growth that education systems well run, health systems well run, then it would be perfect. But at the moment, there are a lot of questions around all of this. some of them based on prejudice, but others suspicions based on real problems in organizations. And I think that is a major challenge that has to be dealt with. Now, as far as the income grant is concerned, at the very time that the Taylor Committee was working on proposals of how to fund it, the World Bank came and pushed these employment projects with Tabu. And they argued that the projects where you just temporarily employ people for a few months will create them employable and it will lead to high growth, and that will solve it. And you'll see that one of the chapters of the Taylor Committee is indeed about how to create employment. And but we then concluded that, as you said, there's no way that we can create employment for the number of people that need it. And the figures have since then doubled, as you've indicated, to around about 12 million people unemployed in the broader definition. And therefore, nowadays it's accepted even in countries that used to have no serious unemployment problems, that modern growth is of such a nature that there's a strong case for an income grant which creates dynamics within a society. So I think the arguments are very strong. The question is, can we deliver? And what are the options available to do it? Now, I totally agree with you that we should not just go for the group above between 18 and 59, that the more money should be spent on the child grant group 2, because a lot of people are not getting sufficient to feed their children properly on that age. I also think that we should think of a universal old age pension, because at the moment what we have is an old age pension which is based on income, and clearly it discourages anyone to save for old age, because if you save for your old age, then you immediately lose your state pension. And so the systems that we proposed, both in the Taylor Commission and in the NAM tax in Namibia, that was virtually accepted and virtually implemented, argues for grants to all groups of population, and they should all be part of the income grant system, not only for those between 49 and 59, 18 and 59. Now, one issue which I see Colin is here, and Colin and I have had many debates on the Taylor Commission, but it's not only the question of how much the grant should be, but do you pay effectively the same grant to everyone? Now, in principle, it's the only thing you can do. Everyone is paid the grant and can ask for a grant. You assume only 60% uptake. I think it's going to be at least 80%. It might be 90% of people that will ask for the grant. But clearly, it means that the bottom third that really are desperately poor get as much money as those at the top. And then you take it back from the top 1%. But effectively, a large proportion of our money goes to people that don't really need more support. The top 20% definitely doesn't need more support. So how does one deal with that issue? Now, what we propose as one of the options in the Taylor Committee, and as the only option for the Namibian Committee, is simply that we say, look, everyone gets the grant, but it should be at the same time an increase in indirect taxation. If we increase indirect taxation, then it's only the person with virtually no income now that gets the full benefit of the grant. The others then pay more indirect taxes back. And it's a gradually scaled thing where you don't have any poverty traps, because everyone loses a bit as the income increases. And then at some stage, in the South African case, it was when you're on the 80% percentile, you actually pay more back than you get. So the grant is targeted. Now, what this means is that and I quite agree with the proposals that we should also use a wealth tax, and I think a capital gains tax should also be used to increase the grant. But at the same time, you target it so that the same tax burden can lead to 3 times as much benefit for the poorest group if you enhance it further with an increase in indirect taxes. It effectively is not an indirect tax increase, but it's a negative expenditure tax, where if your expenditure is below 80%, it increases your income you get progressively, and above 80%, you pay in more and more. And therefore, you don't spread this effectively. You have a targeted grant, even though it's universally paid out. Now, this is a very complicated thing to understand in a short time, and I don't have time to explain it today. But I do think, Duma, I'd like to talk to you more about this. And Colin, I'd like to re-engage with you about this, because I do think that it's for the same tax burden, you can give a grant 3 times as big to the poorest people if you combine the two things. Okay, that's very quick. I know time is of the essence here, and I want to give, I saw the next paper, which is properly and in detail prepared. So I want to give time for that. And I know there's time for questions. So I just wanted to set my position. You can also read my biography, where I have a little note added about this proposal that I have, and ask questions when there's time for it later on. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for getting me back and interested in things. I've been a bit despondent since 2002-03, when I what thought was very good proposals found them to be totally ignored. Zola Squee carried on until his death to fight for this. But within the ANC, there was no one else going for it. And in the other parties, there were no other interests for it either, except for 1 or 2 small parties that are unimportant. I hope that this new move, and pushed by the Institute for Economic Justice and by Colin and Neil, will succeed. I do hope you'll also consider doing it in a fashion where you can get more to the poor and less into the pockets of the top 20%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Leroux, for that very insightful response. You raise a number of interesting issues, especially around the issue of corruption and the private sector being concerned about the issue of corruption around the big. But as we all know, that is not enough. In fact, we cannot let such concerns to stall us from the implementation of the big. In fact, the consequences of not acting would far outweigh any concerns around corruption. But you also do raise a very valid point around making sure that the money goes to those who deserve it the most, instead of ending up in the pockets of those that don't really need much assistance. Please allow me now to introduce our next respondent, Dr. Siraj Mohammed. Siraj Mohammed has worked on economic policy and development since the early 1990s, and the impact of financialization and global corporate restructuring on the South African economy since the early 2000s. His current focus is on macroeconomic policy and government budgeting in his role as Deputy Director for Economics in the South African Parliamentary Budget Office. I won't read the whole biography just to save time. So Dr. Mohammed, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you guys hear me fine and see the presentation? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I also can't see myself, so I'm not sure, and I can't hear myself either. I just want to thank Peter Leroux for those interesting insights and comments on Duma's presentation, and to say that I agree with a lot of what he's said. And I want to thank Duma for this good and insightful piece of work he's done. It's pulled together a lot of what's already out there. There's a growing number, a huge and growing number of different calculations and debates and scenarios of what can be done, what can't be done, and how it can be paid for, and different ways in which it can be paid for. And I'm not going to go into that, into those aspects on the modeling and or lack of modeling, or whatever's being done at the moment. I'm going to sort of try and look more at the big picture things, and to say that Zuma's paper touches on a lot of the key issues within this debate. And it sort of, if we look at it and sort of take a step back and look at the big picture, we can see that, you know, the way in which the discussion is happening outside of thinking through the needs for major restructuring of the South African economy, what its economic structure should be and how it should be transformed. And the discussion of that is sort of seen as, well, we should have a larger industrial base, we should have more productive services and build certain sectors, etc. But the role of social security within that is not adequately discussed. And I think we shouldn't be separating that. And we see within social security provision by the state that it's a central component of governance, and that is too often ignored and absent from discussions about the state and governance. Social security is often treated as something the state does in emergencies or to aid desperate members of society that are unable to get family support. Social security, South Africa's social security system, however, is an integral aspect of the relationship between society and the state. It shapes the nature of the state and its governance of the country. The politics and governance of South Africa over the past century shows how the development and provision of social security was tied into the development of the state and its political efforts to manage large changes in the economy and conflicts. Historically, racism and struggles against racism in the political and economic sphere were key elements in social security provision and state formation and governance. And Duma touches on this in his paper and goes through some of that history. Peter Leroux also spoke about that and sort of looking at the roots of it and what occurred and how unequal it was. And I think it's important to understand, you know, the state and the kind of state within the context of what kind of social security system it is, what they're trying to do, how much they're able to achieve, what they still need to do, how developmental they still need to be within that context. So social security by the state is an important aspect of the state and its ability not only to govern, but also in managing to maintain a national system of administration in a republic with a history of conflict and stark divisions, operating in a dynamic, risk-filled and increasingly integrated world affected by vested interests and their influence over the state. The expansion of social security through increasing access to housing and basic services and the deracialization and expansion of grants to the aged and for child support has been the most successful way in which the post-apartheid government has reduced poverty and improved the average living standards in South Africa. Nothing else government has done, including its efforts to implement business-friendly economic policies and macroeconomic policies deemed credible by financiers and credit ratings agencies, investment and employment incentives, public works programs, industrial policy, and more recently, the supply side structural reforms and as Duma said, neoliberal structural reforms being proposed by National Treasury. None of these have come anywhere close to improving average levels of livelihood and welfare in South Africa as much as social security, particularly cash grants, have. The Department of Social Development stated in the now withdrawn 2021 Green Paper on Comprehensive Social Security and Retirement, they correctly state, non-contributory social assistance is government's principal means of tackling income poverty and the first pillar of the social security system. In 2021, more than 80 million South Africans were eligible for social grants, up from 5.8 million in 2003. However, the government seems reluctant to acknowledge its success in fighting poverty through existing social
Hello, Siraj. Okay, it appears as though Siraj is having issues with his network.
I suspect no one can hear him.
Yeah, when this sort of thing happens, you start suspecting if it's your network that's acting up. Let me try to connect him again. Let me just try to get hold of him. All right, welcome back, Siraj. You're muted. Please unmute.
Sorry, I was just presenting. I didn't realize that I'd lost my connection. I think, yeah, my internet went out and I'm now switched to my 4G, and hopefully that will be will sustain us through whatever happened. Just tell me sort of where you lost me so that I know where to pick up, and I'll try and go fast as well.
We were on the slide that spoke about the importance of social security in improving the general livelihoods of South Africans.
Yeah, so, sorry, this was sort of a bit disorienting to lose connection. I'm sorry that happened. So what I was saying is that, you know, we see that the, social security system and cash grants particularly have been the major way in which government has been able to deal with and respond to poverty, but there's a big gap in that, and the big needs to fill that gap. Because we could be so much more effective in dealing with poverty and inequality. I'm not going to carry on with that. Let me just move on. So the first thing that I wanted to deal with was sort of the approach and the neoliberal approach being taken to taxation, but also the general tenor of the discussion about taxes, and that there are too few South Africans paying tax, and that the tax rate, taxes paid by South Africa are too high. And my first bullet point is the question of whether South Africans can be taxed more has to be discussed beyond superficial opinions about the level of taxes as a percentage of GDP, that by default treat the tax-paying population as homogenous when in fact they live in one of the very most unequal societies in the world. The National Treasury's argument that higher taxes will make South Africa uncompetitive has to be seriously questioned given deindustrialization and financialization. They also do not take into account the negative impact of the extraordinarily high levels of inequality on stability in South Africa. If people want to ask questions later, we can come back to talking about sort of the importance of deindustrialization and financialization in impacting on poverty and inequality, but also on South Africa's growth path and the fact that it hasn't led to the kind of statistics that Duma did show. So the lack of investment, the lack of productive investment, especially by the private sector, and why that's occurred and why jobs haven't been created. So the National Treasury approach is a neoliberal ideological view that there should be lower taxes on individuals and firms, and to broaden the tax base with consumption tax like the VAT. And this is sort of the kind of approach being pushed by the IMF, World Bank, and other neoliberals as well. We're seeing that sort of a lot of this is sort of being questioned even from within the mainstream in economics, especially since Piketty's 2014 book that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with and would have read parts of, because it's such a thick thing. But anyway, Piketty's solution to inequality was an almost confiscatory global tax on inherited wealth and an 80% tax on incomes above $500,000 per annum in the USA. His co-authors and colleagues Saiz and Zuckman in 2019 set goals for tax systems that focus not only on raising tax revenues, but also work to reduce rent-seeking, undue political influencing and lobbying, and other behaviors by the wealthiest people in society that they recognize to be socially destructive. And so we're seeing more and more questioning of what's happening with inequality and the effects of neoliberalism and financialization on the global economy, and this was even well before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And so to come to this question about taxing, I find a lot of insight in the work of Gabriel Palmer and the way in which he uses the Palmer ratio. So a lot of people know what the Palmer ratio is. It's basically looking at the incomes of the top 10% as a ratio to the bottom 40% of, in terms of by income, or the top first decile over the bottom four deciles. But the work that Palmer has done in terms of basically understanding globally what's happened in terms of understanding inequality is really important, I think, to understand South Africa as a serious outlier. If you look at this graph, you see ZA in the top right corner. It's not even in the graph. He's had to put in sort of special dots for Southern Africa. South Africa at 7. This was in 2016. Botswana at 5.9. Namibia at 5.8. And in fact, if you look at the outliers here, there are only 14 countries basically above Palmer ratio of 3. And so this is really important to understand, that we form an unambiguous and unbelievable outlier within a global story, where we think of countries like India, China, and many other developing countries as usually unequal. And South Africa is a special case of itself, and they, even amongst the 14 with ratios above 3, we are spectacularly high. So he categorizes countries according to equality, and he finds huge diversity in inequality. And he also looks at the Gini coefficient, and his work makes him also question the usefulness of the Gini coefficient, because he finds that a lot of what's happening is happening at the tails, and that the Gini is being sort of spread over and the way in which the Lorenz curve is formed sort of puts into the overall story what's happening at the tails in the top 10 and the bottom 40. So, and within this increasing diversity, Palmer finds an interesting pattern for almost all countries except for 14, as I said, Latin American countries, South Africa, and other Southern African countries. The share that goes to the middle group that he refers to as administering classes is generally around 50%. And this graph sort of shows you that the share of deciles 5 to deciles 9, and we see that in the more equal countries, it would actually be close to 60. In the less equal countries, it would sort of go 10 towards 50 and maybe drop a little below 50. But generally, you know, it's in that kind of range. So Palmer says it seems then that the key aim of the administrative classes is to protect as a group their overall share of income, while in the other half of the population, the top 10% is bent on enlarging the share at the expense of the bottom 40%. He develops a variable that he calls D10 plus, which is the amount that the top decile, the top 10% take from the bottom 40% that causes the Palmer ratio to rise above 1. He calls this D10 plus this variable distributional failure. And this graph gives an example of countries where you've got Finland that has a Palmer ratio of 1. This is again 2016 data. And so you see this division. We've got D5 to D9, 54%, D10, the top 10%, 23%, and the bottom D1 to D4 at 23% also. So it's sort of a fairly and one of the more equal societies. And then if you compare Uruguay, which has a Palmer ratio of 1.8, we see that, again, the D5 to D9 get exactly the same as Finland, but here we see that the top 10% basically takes, if you compare it to Finland, or what would be required to get to a Palmer ratio of 1 for Uruguay, they basically take 7% of the share that would have gone to the bottom 40%. So this D10 plus variable gives us a sense of sort of the dysfunction within the division or the income distribution. Now, as I said, only 14 countries post the Palmer ratio above 3. in a few countries, inequality becomes extreme because D10 not only can squeeze the bottom 40%, D1 to D4 even further, but it also is able to bring the share of D5 to D9 into play. This is the middle. And when I read this in Palmer, I often think about the Treasury and wanting to put pressure on public sector wages. I mean, this is sort of where as part of the distribution. But anyway, I won't go into that in detail. So the D10 plus is this variable he comes up with, and it says that the share of D10 indicating how this decile succeeded in pushing the share of D5 to D9 below 50% of national income. So this is sort of distributional failure number 2. And if you look at South Africa and Brazil, so Brazil's Palmer ratio is between 3 and 4, and South Africa makes Brazil look puny in terms of inequality here. And Palmer actually calls Brazil extreme inequality and South Africa obscene inequality. And we're seeing that the D10 plus, basically the share that's being taken from the bottom 10% is about 18%, and then they're taking 8% also from the middle. So in South Africa and those countries, and what's interesting about those countries is that the extractive countries, the countries that had shifts towards democracy, with you had institution change linked to democracy, but economies haven't changed. And so we're seeing that the elites are able to do more of what they want and how they want to do it, and able to take a bigger share of the income distributions in those countries. And South Africa is one of the extreme cases of that. And definitely a sign that government should be playing a much more interventionist, active role. Now, Palmer also looks at the Gini's, and he uses a data set from another author that basically says this is what the market wage is. And we see that in countries like the United Kingdom, in the bottom left, and Japan, for instance, that the Gini has risen over time. These graphs go from 1960 to 2014. And this is because of neoliberalism and more neoliberal policies in those countries. And so as they become more unequal, the market wage becomes more unequal. But we see in countries, the Nordic countries, even in Britain, Japan, and Eastern Europe, Western Europe, these countries' disposable income Gini, which is sort of after government does its transfers and redistribution, and there's a very conscious effort to maintain equality and keep the Gini low in these countries, we see okay, thank you. We see huge drops in the Gini coefficient and inequality for this country. So what Palmer is saying is that because of neoliberalism, the Western European countries and others that do make these efforts are using a huge convoluted way in which to basically maintain equality within their countries at a fairly high cost. And it's often challenged politically by the elites. And it's sort of, and he says that a lot of their increases in debt is related to this. And that's something that I won't go into now. So if you look at countries, South Africa's in the bottom right corner. We've got India, we've got China, we've got Brazil. Yes, I've just taken a selection of graphs from his papers for 2016. And we see that these countries haven't had the same kind of pressures and commitment to reducing inequality caused by increases in the Gini by the market wage. And in South Africa, you actually see that neoliberalism actually didn't cause as much of a sharp increase as in other countries to the market wage, but we see in South Africa that there's been a 14% drop because of distributive policies, and it shows how much more can be done. So I wanted to use this in response to the arguments that too few South Africans are paying taxes, that the tax burden is too high, that the tax share as a percentage of GDP is high compared to other countries. And even if you want to believe those stats and want to show those stats, I think looking at the levels and the absurdity of inequality in South Africa and within this global context, but also in understanding the shares that it's going to the top 10 compared to in South Africa compared to other countries, and now the middle is also being squeezed, and the political implications of that is really important. And so we definitely need to look at tax reform and way beyond what the Davis Tax Commission and some of the assumptions and approaches have been very neoliberal, and we should seriously think about how we approach the tax system and tax reform in South Africa. So just to end, there are too many ways in which the terms of the discussion in South Africa around the big and social security has been set by neoliberals. This caused us to focus on the wrong issues and to ask the wrong questions. Of course, government can and must spend more, even if it has to borrow more. I think the events in July this year has shown us the kind of damage that we can expect with future protests, future social unrest. So we're faced with it's almost daily social protests within local government and confined to local government areas that cause destruction to government infrastructure, social infrastructure, affect economies at a local level. But we see from July how damaging and how quick the damage and large the damage can be to the economy and inequality and poverty is a huge cause of this, and it gives people the ability to sort of mobilize people even if they don't necessarily support the causes that they're being mobilized for. So, and then the next issue I want to raise was whether South Africa ends up with spiraling debt depends on how government in South Africa choose to self-constrain the country's options. And here, by choosing neoliberal policies, by saying we can't draw on PIC funds, Duma's been saying a lot of these things for a long time, looking at the options. By saying that we can't actually have the South African Reserve Bank monetize South Africa's debt. They actually are pushing us into a process where we look bad and creating a self-fulfilling prophecy within credit ratings agencies and foreign owners of our local currency debt to where we actually could see that kind of spiral happening. Now, there's several routes to find more money for the big and other important sources of finance, including the South African Reserve Bank by sovereign debt. The important issue is not the availability of money for short-term relief and recovery, but how this expenditure gets integrated into long-term plans to restructure the South African economy. Taxation should be used for redistribution, but that redistribution should be related to economic restructuring, or the dysfunction and inequality will continue. The question is not about how to grow the economy and attract investment, but what kind of economy we want to build for all South Africans. And then it brings me back to the initial point that social security is an important part of the identity of the society and the state, and the way in which the country's government, they can't be separated from issues of economic and structural transformation. And the way in which we identify the state and the role of the state is really important in that. And as a last point, just to say that I've become really bothered by how politicians and people in the media use the word welfare and welfare state in a derogatory fashion. And it shows a huge misunderstanding and a strong influence and hegemony of neoliberal thought in South Africa. And we really need to start challenging this notion that, this derogatory notion of welfare and the welfare state. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that and for weathering the technical disturbances with great equanimity. I'm not going to summarize because we have limited time for engagement from the floor. I do just want to pick up Suraj's last point, which is that I think with regards to one of the false binaries that between developmental state and welfare state, to my understanding, most of the European states after the Second World War, when creating welfare states, were the necessary foundation and platform for developmental states. So I think we've got a very poor ideological grasp of what welfare states mean. So Peter, as well, thank you very, very much. you managed to condense similarly a wealth of information into a limited time. I noticed that there are not any hands up. There has been a discussion in the chat between Neil and Peter. And in the absence of any others, I would like to know whether there is a desire to go back to that. I also just need to share that Uta Dirksen from FVS sends her apologies. She had to go to an official delegation meeting. But are there people who would like to raise some of their own concerns and interpretation as to what has been traversed? Clearly 2 hours is certainly not enough to give sufficient airtime to all of the issues in the paper. If not, then I would like to open up to the panelists and respondents. Duma, would you like to respond to anything that the initial respondents have responded to your paper?
Thank you very much. I just want to thank Siraj, Dr. Mohammed, and Professor Leroux for these comments that you make. They will enrich the final version of the paper, which we'll release on the 27th of the 27th at the end of the month. That incorporates a lot of the things that you talk about here. And Siraj, starting at the back, Siraj, thanks a lot for providing us with the link between basic income and the wider restructuring of our society. And I'll look to those slides as I like the talk obscene inequality and extreme inequality in South Africa and Brazil. And also I'll never get, when people say that South Africans are taxed too much, I'll know which presentation to go and look to. And Peter, Professor Leroux, thank you so much for your input. You know, the issue of the state-owned companies, I kind of ignored SAA for a long period because I decided that it hasn't got macroeconomic impact at all. Yeah, what happens to SAA doesn't really, it hasn't got macroeconomic impact. And if you look at Eskom and Transnet, I believed, rightly or wrongly, that those are the ones that have macroeconomic impact. And if you look throughout the 2000s, the 2010, sorry, and during the boom, Eskom and Transnet accounted for 80% of government, public corporation, in fact, government investment. They accounted for 80% of state-owned company investment and the majority of public investment in the economy during those boom years that I was talking about, the so-called boom years that I was talking about. And I've become very interested in Eskom lately, Professor, and I've even done a paper on the financing, the financial crisis at Eskom. And you're 100% correct. And the whole Eskom issue, we can't grow if yesterday I had 9 hours of no electricity. I mean, I had 9 hours of no electricity. Everything came to a standstill. Even my limited productivity got impacted yesterday. And I was listening on the radio. Someone was calling from Mamelodi. And he says, no, in Mamelodi, since last night, we've had stage 8 load shedding. And he went on to explain what was happening in Mamelodi. And then a friend of mine who lives in Midrand in a fancy estate, he said, when I was telling him about this, he says, we had no water for a week. And so it's a desperate situation. And in a way, it's a chicken and the egg situation. And I think what's happening at Eskom is going to be, after basic income, the most important debate in this country. Because the neoliberal restructuring of Eskom is going to cause the kind of crisis that we're seeing in Europe. And it's a train that is running away, because the solution that has been proposed to the issue of Eskom is going to make things worse in terms of our country. So we should look at so the issues that Siraj was talking about, restructuring the economy, and also what the professor's talking about Eskom. And I shouldn't tell Isabel about this, but I mean, after this basic income thing, that is the number one issue that I want to look at in terms of Eskom, because it's so critically important. for the future of our country. And I believe that what the government is doing is going to plunge us even into a worse crisis in terms of the restructuring of Eskom. I believe in the public option for Eskom. I don't believe in, we have to reverse the privatization of Eskom. They call it, it's not privatization, but that's where the end goal is. When you have a finance minister saying we must list Eskom on the stock exchange, it's mind-boggling, you know. I don't know. So Professor Le Roux and Siraj, I will talk to you at detailed, Professor, about the issue about the indirect taxes that you're talking about, and maybe we can integrate in the final paper that we release in 2 weeks' time. And same with Siraj. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Duma. Peter, would you like to have a wrap-up comment on where you think the paper makes some good points, and if there are any areas that you think we should be looking at to augment before we publish the paper at the end of the month?
I think the point about the public corporations I want to agree with. Eskom and also the Transnet is as important to get it to work properly again. If you see what's happening in all the small towns where Transnet used to be the sort of factor that kept the town going, and they're not working. And the problem of safely traveling on our railways between places, it has to be transformed, and the private sector won't do it. But there's no guarantee that given what's happening at present, the public sector will either, because it calls for a tough government. If you look at the Swedish Vattenfall, which runs most of the Swedish electricity, it's done efficiently, but it's also done with increasing productivity and not decreasing, as was the case in both Eskom. And so it's a very big, major restructuring. I've always wanted Eskom to remain a public organization. I argued that in the late 90s. But if we can't restructure it, then the only option is to privatize. It's a bit like, I'm all for public education, but a lot of public schools are simply not working. And at some stage, it might be better to give the money to the parents to get their own schooling. We have to look at the delivery capacity. And it is difficult for a political party to restructure organizations when the major proportion of their votes come from trade unions running that organization. And so the challenge is not only to go against the privatization, but to at the same time go against policies of the trade unions, which in many cases protect the interests of the teacher rather than the student, protect the interests of the worker at Eskom rather than the person who needs the electricity in the townships. So it's a big challenge. And that's what I really was thinking of, is going to need to be dealt with if we are all going to get back to 4 or 5% growth rates, not even to speak of 6%. Because if that is not properly run, and if our schools are not properly restructured, we are in severe trouble. I might be wrong. By the way, I'm retired as professor. I'm just Peter now. So you'll see that I use that too. Okay. And thanks, Duma. I'd like to speak to you about the other things. I see Neil also speaks about proposals that they have on slides 42 and 43 I'll look at. The whole point is that the indirect taxation that we propose was part of a negative expenditure tax and not an increase in overall value-added tax. It was a way to target the grant so that the poor get more. And the one point I forgot, and that is, if I just have Isabel, if I just have half a second that I wanted to make. The income grant has very significant redistribution impacts when it gets into the hands of the poor. And the studies in Namibia by the Harmans and so show that, as also was claimed by Ute, that people go out and get work and so. But more income to the top 40% probably stimulates the computer industry or the iPhone production in China more than the food production in South Africa. So it is important, if we can, in terms of the Bassanetti and Carter models, which were all the rage among the left when I was a student in England, to make sure that the grant effectively gets more of it to the poor and that one recoups it through other means from those at the top. We have to pay everyone the grant, because to target a grant is impossible. We have to pay everyone the grant, but recoup it through taxation methods. From the top 1% it's easy to recoup it, but also from the top 5% and 10% we have to recoup it in order to help, because the top 10%, as my good old friend Gabriel Palma's study shows. The top 10% of South Africa is doing extremely well, and they shouldn't be subsidized even further at the cost of those at the bottom. Good luck, and I wish you win this struggle. My big failure in my life is that we lost that battle at the time. I think we should have been clever, Rivian and me and a few other guys when we fought it then. And I hope you succeed now, because if you can get a proper income grant going, it's going to make a big difference. But also your challenge is much bigger. It was easier then. Then we just had to change that because the other organizations were still run relatively well. Now there is the past 10 years of the lost decade is going to be very important to realize what all went wrong and to recuperate that. Good luck, and thanks for inviting me to participate.
Thanks, Peter. And I know that you claim that you're retired, but I don't think we're going to let you be very inactive in your in future weeks and months, because the thinking that you put into this and the work that you've done is as valid today as it was then. So thank you. And Siraj, have you got any closing statements, questions, challenges?
Yeah, I was going to respond to your question about the comments on the paper and where I thought things could be added. And I'm not going to suggest that Duma looks at sort of the macroeconomic history and the process of deindustrialization and financialization in detail, but to some extent, the discussions of the periods he talks about could include some reference to that. But why I think that's important is because it raises issues around, the South African growth path and what is possible and how a more equal distribution of income would be linked to a different economic structure, and that the state can play that role partly through social security. Linked to that, I mean, my response to the different numbers that have come up on the multiplier, the fiscal multiplier. The Treasury is claiming that it's been very low and in some years negative, and that just spending more is a problem because it's not going to have the impact that people are saying. In the budget review this year, the reason they gave for taking away that increased taxes that would have raised 40 billion was basically to say that they figured, based on a paper by Kemp, to say that the fiscal multiplier of spending more would actually come up with less GDP than actually taking those taxes away from businesses. And so my response to a lot of the discussions about the multiplier is that, you can have all kinds of studies that are backward looking with all kinds of assumptions, and some crazy assumptions, some better assumptions, and different economic approaches, and we're seeing sort of also some fairly mixed up approaches happening. But that we should look at the multiplier as a policy variable that government can affect by actually spending more money on the poor. And this also relates to my view on corruption and the misallocation of capital. Something like the big end, those kind of cash grants are probably one of the best ways to get money into the hands of the poor with the least amount of corruption involved as well. And so it becomes a really good policy tool that supports the fiscal multiplier, but it also takes into account the levels of corruption that we have and how endemic corruption we have is in South Africa. The other point I had was sort of linked to the cost of South African debt, and basically the arguments that South African debt is too high. And so, I mean, Duma's approach is sort of very much informed by MMT, and basically then that the state can spend that money. But, it may be worth examining what if they decide not to do that. And then to think about, why South Africa's interest rates are that high. And I think one of the things that I come across recently that was interesting, the Daily Maverick, was this set of 3 papers that Michael Power, who used to be with Investec, did. And he's basically, they're saying that the South African exchange rate should sort of be judged according to the currency in Bengal, not linked to the dollar the way it is. And to some extent, our financialization and the way in which South Africa operates, with the finance sector so dominant, makes us a very sort of dollar-related economy. But if we're thinking about South Africa's competitiveness in the world, and where we're selling in and the supply chains that we may want to enter, I think Michael Power has a point. And so his point is that the Reserve Bank is looking at defending the rand with high interest rates, but based on the wrong currency, and that there's much more, there's actually room to actually have the interest rates be much lower. And you know, lots of our debt is local currency denominated debt, even if a lot of foreigners are buying that debt. But the Reserve Bank's rates have a huge impact on the domestic currency sovereign debt rates. And so that also could be an avenue to maybe mention or look at, or something to think about. Yeah, I suppose I can take it offline with Duma if he's got any other questions about other things, but I'll stop there. I think I've taken lots of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Suraj, Peter, and Duma once again. And now I invite Dr. Zulu from SPI to do the final thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Duma. Always a pleasure. Great presentation, by the way. I was taken by the numbers and all of that, but also having been at an intimate look into how the work was put together. I know the hard hours that you put into this and the back and forth. It was well worth it. Thank you for that. To Peter and Suraj, thank you for your responses. Listening to Duma spoke to the dignity floor, and Suraj, you spoke to the July riots. And within all of that, I think all of us, South Africans, we owe it to this country to not see a repeat of what happened. And if BIG, in whatever form and shape, Peter, it can be, we need to fight for that and stand for it. To the panelists, thank you once again. But also to the SPI team, thank you, Nkululeko, for facilitating this process. To Lindy K, Tina, Duduzo, Mpo, Isop, thank you. And to the people that joined us for this webinar, thank you very much. We're going to have another series, the second part of this look at the multipliers from Duma on the 20th of October, 22nd of October. And then the last one is the...
in fact, Dumas is the last one.
Dumas is the last one. Sorry, I got my dates wrong. So we're the 20th and 22nd of October. So 20th of October, Nkululeko will be presenting his review of what has worked in mostly in African countries. But Duma will then have a second bite at the cherry where he speaks to a different version of the economic multipliers. And yeah, so please join us for those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sadly, we can't say join us for coffee and snacks. But I encourage you to go to your respective kitchens and find such. Thank you.